From client-centered to the client's narrative, from modern to the post-modern. Imagine, it's 1997. The client-centered approach, otherwise known as a Rogerian approach, has been popular for the past 4 to 5 decades. Its great founder, Carl Rogers, remains to be famous even 10 years after his death. Famous in various areas: politics, education, international relations, social work, non-traditional areas in counseling, pastoral care, which is quite interesting since Carl Rogers was hovering around atheism and agnosticism during the times he was developing his client-centered approach. But we'll talk about that some other day. The doctors in US, Canada, and UK who were trying to improve general practice and modernize it by turning it into family practice or family medicine during the 1950s and the 1960s felt that this popular approach would fit perfectly well in this new specialty field, something more psychosocial, something that would distinguish them from the very impersonal, non-psychosocial clinical fields, which were threatening to drive general practice towards the periphery of medical care. And so we now eavesdrop on a counseling session, 1997. At first, the session looks the same. It seems like it's client-centered. The provider or counselor is treating the patient as if the patient is the expert and not the provider. There's clear and palpable attempts at understanding and empathy. It's very collaborative. There's a lot of respect and positive regard. It seems like there's a lot of optimism, a sense that the provider feels that the client can and will be able to solve his or her problem. There's compassion. It's very caring and very personal. But there's something that feels very different. The provider is still trying to understand the patient. It still feels non-directive. There's a stance of not knowing. He's still asking about the experience, not just asking questions to gather clinical information, but the way the questions are asked and the flow of the discourse and the conversation. It seems to be heading someplace different. It seems like there's really an attempt to make the client tell his or her story, a narration, a narrative of his or her experiences. And as the narrative or the story takes shape and form, it seems like the provider is trying to separate the problem from the person, and there's a sense that the problem is the problem and not the person. And as the new story takes shape, it looks like the person is feeling a little better from a very problematic life, indistinguishable or fused with the problems, from narratives filled with problems and problem-saturated stories. The person seems to have recovered his or her life and is narrating the influence of the problem in his or her life and how his or her life had controlled and influenced the problem. Suddenly, the hero of the narrative, the patient or the person, moved from being the problem to being with the problem, and success events or sparkling moments appear in their narratives when he or she was able to deal effectively with the problem. Actually, the provider looks like he's looking for unique, successful, good stories, moments of good choices, moments of success, times when the problem wanted to take over and the person was successful in resisting it. And suddenly the person is beginning to think he or she can deal with this problem. This is doable. Change and success is possible. And the story and the narrative is getting better. As we observe this too, the provider and the client, it seems like they're rewriting stories, alternative good stories, something better than the initial problem-saturated story. And if we're lucky enough, we'll see somewhat of a turning point when the client has significantly replaced the problem-saturated stories with one that is much, much better. After the session, the practitioner or care provider seems to be writing an email, a letter of sorts, describing what just happened, highlighting the client's strengths and abilities, how he or she was successful in developing a new story and changing the problem-saturated story. And it looks like this letter will clearly strengthen the new story and further encourage the client. So finally, we say there's something different about this. This is not the client-centered approach of the 1960s and the 1970s. This is something very different. If we're going to give it a name, we'll call it story approach or narrative approach. And that's exactly what it is. So, what is it exactly? Well, it's one of those new postmodern approaches of the late 80s and early 90s, meaning it's different from modern, which we are all familiar with. Very scientific, objective, based on observed and what is systematically knowable. People go to the provider with problems. The provider and the patient has some kind of an idea what's normal, and the treatment started to make this diagnosed problem go away. Postmodern is more focused on subjective reality, not objective reality. Realities are socially constructed. A client is depressed or has an anxiety problem because he or she has adopted the definition of what it is to be depressed or have an anxiety disorder. The client's reality is real and true, and the provider will not argue with the client on whether it's accurate, true, rational, or not. It is the client's reality. In short, each one of us are carrying a lot of stories which we tell ourselves, and stories which others tell about us. And these stories shape our lives and our realities. And so, from an approach which helps clients grow and find their true selves, we now have an approach which helps clients rewrite their stories or narratives. And so, from the 1980s to the 1990s onwards, as interest in client-centered approaches waned, the new kids on the block, the postmodern approaches, such as the narrative approach, solution-focused brief therapy, began to take over the field and even influence the traditional approaches, including the client-centered approach. In particular, the influence of postmodern ideas is very noticeable in family care and community care approaches, on how dominant popular narratives in social groups, families, and in communities can have a positive or a negative impact on the client's subjective reality and narratives.